Welcome back to Dirty Laundry, the place where we do not just air the secrets, we deep clean them. Everyone has a little something they want to hide, a stain they cannot quite wash out. But here we totally embrace the mess. We dive into the most scandalous stories, hidden truths, and ultimate unfiltered drama. Grab your popcorn, sit back, and get ready. Because today our cycle is about to spin out of control. Do not forget to hit that subscribe button before we uncover what is really in the basket. I cooked the gumbo from scratch that Thanksgiving morning, the way I have done for 45 years. I set the table, I lit the candles, then I placed a wooden box at the center that contained everything I had spent 10 months gathering in silence. My son's wife sat down across from me and smiled. I smiled back. Neither of us said what we were really thinking. The morning had started the way every Thanksgiving of my adult life had started. Before the smiling and the silence and the box in the dark. With a pot and a flame and the smell of a kitchen that still carried the memory of the woman who had taught me to cook in it. I got up at 3:30. I have not needed an alarm clock since 1968. The roux takes time. That is the first thing Diane ever told me about cooking gumbo, and it is still the only instruction worth keeping. You cannot rush it, and you cannot walk away from it. You stand at the stove and you stir and you wait, and eventually the color shifts and the smell changes and you know. That morning, I stood there for a long time, stirring slowly. With Diane's apron tied around my waist, she had worn that apron every Thanksgiving for 31 years. Blue cotton, faded a little along the edges. Her name embroidered at the chest in the green thread she had chosen herself from a shop on Decatur Street the summer we opened. I take it down from the wall on Thanksgiving morning before I do anything else. Some habits are not habits. They are decisions you make over and over until the making of them becomes indistinguishable from who you are. Before I left the kitchen to set the dining room, I checked the gas valve behind the stove, a quarter turn right, then back to center. Diane had started that ritual years ago and never explained it. I had never stopped doing it. The guests began arriving at 11. Miss Loretta came first, the way she always does, early enough to rearrange whatever she thinks I have placed wrong. Hector and his wife came shortly after, friends who had been eating at this table since before my son was born. The dining room filled with the particular warmth of people who have been doing something together for a long time. Carlos worked the kitchen alongside me, moving between the stove and the pass-through with the efficiency of a man who had been doing this for 18 years. He knew where everything was kept. He knew the rhythm of the kitchen on a busy afternoon. I had known Carlos since he was 22 years old. Diane had embroidered his name on his first apron herself. Patrick and Sloan arrived 40 minutes after everyone else. They came through the front door mid-conversation, and by the time I walked out to greet them, the conversation had stopped. Patrick hugged me the way he has hugged me for several years now, briefly and at a slight angle, as though he had forgotten how long to hold on. Sloan offered her cheek. We sat down. The gumbo was served. Someone poured wine. Outside. The afternoon had gone gray, and a thin rain was beginning against the windows. The wooden box sat at the center of the table where I had placed it that morning. No one had asked about it. I had not offered any explanation. I watched my daughter-in-law's eyes find the box. She picked up her wine glass, turned it slowly in her fingers, and set it back down. She looked around the table, at the guests, at the candles, then back at the box, then back at me. She tapped the rim of her glass once with one finger. The table went quiet. "I would like to say a few words," she said. The room went quiet in the way rooms only go quiet when something has gone badly wrong. Sloane was on her feet before Patrick could stop her. She had that look she got when the wine made her bold. Chin up, eyes bright. The kind of bright that has nothing warm behind it. She held her glass out to the table like she was offering a toast, though everyone who knew her understood that whatever was coming was not meant to honor anyone. "Before Walter makes his little speech," she said, her voice carrying easily across the room, "I want to say a few words." Patrick reached for her arm. "Sloane, maybe we should—" "I'm fine." She pulled away without looking at him. "I'm perfectly fine." She turned toward me, and I watched her gather herself the way a person does when they have been rehearsing something for a long time and have finally decided tonight is the night. "To my father-in-law," she said, raising her glass. "A man who has spent 75 years holding on to a building and calling it a legacy. A man so committed to the past that he turned this restaurant into a museum instead of a business. A man who never once asked his own son what he actually wanted. Because what Walter wants is the only thing that has ever mattered in this family." She paused to let that land around the table. I could see people I had known for 20 and 30 years looking at their plates or at the candles or anywhere that was not my face. "Diane used to say that you were the most stubborn man she had ever loved," Sloane continued. "Personally, I think she was being generous. I think she got out while the getting was good. And honestly, I don't blame her one bit." The table went completely silent. Diane did not get out. Diane died with her boots on in a flooded kitchen, holding a book of recipes that Sloane had been trying to get her hands on for 3 years. Everyone at that table knew that. The men who had rebuilt this restaurant after Katrina knew it. Miss Loretta, who had come to Diane's funeral and held my hand at the graveside, knew it. And Sloane knew that they knew it. She said it anyway. Patrick did not speak. He did not look up from his plate. He sat with his shoulders pulled slightly inward. The same posture I had watched him develop over 8 years of marriage. The posture of a man who has learned that the safest thing he can do is make himself smaller and wait for the storm to pass. Sloane sat back down and reached for the wine bottle. I did not say anything for a long moment. I let the silence do its work. And then, slowly, I smiled. Diane called it my dangerous smile. She said it was the only expression I had that genuinely worried her. Not because it meant I was angry, but because it meant I had already figured something out and was simply waiting for the other person to catch up. Here is what nobody in that room knew, except for me. I had been expecting exactly this. 3 weeks earlier, I had allowed Carlos to overhear a conversation I had staged deliberately. I stood near the back hallway and talked loudly on the phone about my plans to formally transfer leadership of the restaurant to Patrick at Thanksgiving dinner. I knew Carlos would carry that information to Sloane within the hour. I knew Sloane would see the dinner as an opportunity she could not pass up, a public stage where she could embarrass me badly enough that no one would take my announcement seriously. I needed her to stand up. I needed every person in this room to see exactly who she was before I showed them what she had done. The dinner was never a celebration. It was a courtroom, and I had spent 10 months preparing the case. I stood up slowly. I could see Sloane watching the movement with the kind of attention you give something that suddenly does not behave the way you expected. I reached under the table and lifted the wooden box onto the surface between the candles and the breadbasket. The box was old, made from cypress, the same wood my grandfather had used to build the original bar. Diane had kept her recipe book in it for as long as I could remember. She had pressed it into my hands at the door the morning of the storm, before she turned back. "Guard this," she had said. I did not know then that it would be the last thing she ever asked of me. I watched Sloane's face change. She recognized the box. She had tried twice to get inside the safe where I kept it. Once with Carlos's help, and once with a locksmith she had sent to the house on a day she thought I had a doctor's appointment. She knew the box. What she did not know was what else I had placed inside it over the past 10 months. "Thank you for that speech, Sloane," I said. My voice came out steady. Steadier than I felt, if I am being honest. But 69 years of running a kitchen in the Louisiana heat teaches you something about staying calm when everything around you is going wrong. Now it's my turn. I looked around the table. At Miss Loretta, who had set down her spoon. At the men who had hauled waterlogged timber out of this dining room after the flood. At Patrick, who had finally looked up from his plate. His eyes moving between me and his wife like a man trying to figure out which version of the world he was living in. "But before I open this box," I said, "I need to tell you how we got here. Because this story did not begin tonight. It began 3 years ago. And it began, the way these things always do, with something that seemed very small. 3 years ago, I still believed in the version of Sloane that she showed at family dinners. Quiet and well-dressed, asking about the restaurant with what seemed like genuine interest, refilling my coffee before I had to ask. Looking back now, I understand that she was studying the place the way a contractor studies a building before putting in a bid. She was taking inventory. The changes started small, the way a leak starts small. The first thing to disappear was the photograph of my grandmother standing in front of this restaurant in 1951. A young woman in a white apron, squinting into the summer sun. That photograph had hung on the wall beside the host stand for longer than I had been alive. One morning I came in and it was gone. When I asked Carlos about it, he said Sloane had taken it down for reframing. I waited 6 months. The photograph never came back. Then the framed menu from our first year went missing. Then the black and white portrait of my father, taken the year he paid off the mortgage. One by one, the things that made Brennan's what it was disappeared off the walls, replaced by clean paint and a neutral palette that Sloane described as more professional. What she meant was more hers. But the apron was different. Diane had worn that apron for the last 12 years of her life. It was faded blue cotton with her initials stitched along the hem, and I had hung it above the prep station after she died because taking it down felt like admitting something I was not ready to admit. One afternoon I came into the kitchen and it was gone. I searched the whole restaurant before I found it. It was in the trash bin behind the building, folded neatly, which told me everything I needed to know. You do not fold something neatly before you throw it away, unless you want someone to know it was not an accident. When I brought it up at dinner that week, Sloane looked at me with what I can only describe as practiced sympathy. "Oh, Walter, I'm so sorry. I thought it was an old rag. It didn't have a label." She touched Patrick's arm as she said it, and Patrick said, "Dad, maybe we should let it go." I washed the apron when I got home. I hung it back on the wall. I did not bring it up again. I started eating dinner alone most nights around that time. Diane's chair sat across from mine at the kitchen table at home. the one she had picked out at an antique shop on Magazine Street the year we got married. And some evenings I would eat a full meal in silence with that empty chair across from me, wondering what she would say if she could see what was happening to the family she had loved so well. That was also when the distance from my son began to widen into something I could not close. Sloane managed Patrick's schedule the way a secretary manages a difficult client, keeping his calendar full, rerouting his attention, making sure there was always something more urgent than a phone call with his father. I would call. He would not answer. I would leave a message. He would return it 3 days later, distracted, 10 minutes before another meeting. I've been crazy busy. Dad, you know how it is. I did not know how it was. I had never in 40 years been too busy for my father. She started working on his perception of me the same way she worked on the walls of the restaurant. One small thing at a time. She would say things in front of me that were addressed to him. Poor Walter. We just let him putter around the kitchen so he feels useful. She said it in front of 2 line cooks one evening, her voice light and almost affectionate. The way you talk about an old dog that still thinks it is doing something important. Within a week, I had heard the words repeated back to me by someone who thought they were being kind. Then Patrick started asking me questions I had never heard from him before. Dad, do you think you might be overdoing it? Sloane's worried you're pushing too hard. And once, quietly, without quite meeting my eyes. Maybe you should see someone, just to get checked out. Make sure everything's okay up there. He touched his temple when he said it. That was Sloane's language. I had spent 40 years watching how ideas travel, how a word planted in the right ear takes root and grows until the person carrying it believes it was always their own thought. My son was telling me to get my mind examined, but it was not my son talking. Some nights I would sit in the kitchen after closing with a cup of coffee and my wife's recipe book open on the table in front of me, not reading it exactly, just sitting with it. The handwriting on those pages was the closest thing I had left to her voice. And there were nights when I needed to hear it. I would sit there in the quiet and ask the empty room a question I had never asked myself before she died. Am I becoming a burden? Is this what it feels like to be in the way? Then one evening, I was walking through the office, and I heard Sloane talking to Patrick on the other side of the door. He will never let you be your own man as long as he's around, she said. You know that. I stood in the hallway and did not move for a long time. I want to be clear about something. Those words did not break me, but they were the first time I understood, fully and without any room for doubt, that what was happening in my family was not a misunderstanding. It was not poor communication or a difficult adjustment period, or the ordinary friction of people learning to share something they all love differently. It was a plan. And I was the problem it was designed to solve. The anniversary of Diane's death falls on the 3rd Thursday of October. Every year I wear her ring on a chain around my neck for that one day. I started doing it the 1st October after she died, and I have not stopped since. It was not a ritual I planned. It was just something I needed. That October, when I reached into the drawer for the ring, I found it empty. I stood there for a long time, my hand still inside the drawer, like if I kept searching long enough, I would eventually feel the familiar weight of it. The pearl necklace her mother had given her on their wedding day, the pocket watch that had belonged to my father, the one I had planned to give Patrick when he got married, the plain gold band I had slipped onto Diane's finger in a church on Canal Street on a Saturday afternoon 45 years ago. All of it gone. I called Patrick. I did not intend to accuse anyone. I simply wanted to know if he had seen them. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, in the careful voice Sloane had taught him to use when managing difficult situations, "Dad, are you sure you didn't misplace them? Sloane mentioned you've been forgetting things lately." I hung up the phone and sat down at the kitchen table. 2 days later, I drove to Metairie. I had called every pawn shop I could find within 15 miles of the restaurant, and the third one I reached described the items closely enough that I knew. The man behind the counter was young, maybe 25, and he looked at me with the particular discomfort of someone who suspects they are about to be part of something sad. The ring came to $400. The necklace was $320. The watch had been sold already to someone else, and I accepted there was nothing I could do about the watch. I paid in cash. The young man put the ring and the necklace in a small velvet bag and slid them across the glass counter. "Special occasion?" he asked. "My wife gave me this ring 45 years ago," I said. "Someone stole it." He did not say anything after that. I drove home and sat in the car in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside. Then I locked the ring and the necklace in the safe alongside Diane's recipe book, and I kept every receipt. A month after that, I got a phone call from Raymond Thibodeau, a retired school teacher who had been eating at Brennan's since before I was running it. He had driven up from Houston to try the new franchise location, and he was calling me from the parking lot. "Ah, Walter," he said, "I don't know how to tell you this, but that wasn't your gumbo." I drove to Houston the next morning, 6 hours each way. I walked into the kitchen of the franchise location, introduced myself to a young prep cook who had no idea who I was, and I asked him to show me what they were using for the base. He opened a refrigerator and showed me bags of frozen shrimp imported from Southeast Asia and containers of pre-mixed seasoning paste that came in bulk from a food service warehouse in Dallas. I picked up one of the containers and read the label. The third ingredient was maltodextrin. I took a small amount of the finished gumbo from the steam table and tasted it. It was warm and it was thick, and it resembled gumbo the way a photograph resembles the person in it. The shape was right, but there was nothing alive in it. I stood in that kitchen for a long while without saying anything. Then I thanked the prep cook and drove home. That night I went into the kitchen at Brennan's after it closed, and I made the gumbo myself. Fresh shrimp from the Gulf. The roux built from scratch. 6 hours from start to finish. When I tasted it, something was wrong. I made it again the next night. Same thing. Wrong in a way I could not name. Like hearing a song played in the wrong key. The notes were all there, but the music was off. I lay awake that third night, asking myself the question I had been avoiding for months. What if they were right? What if my palate had started to fail along with my knees and the steadiness of my left hand? What if the thing I had trusted most, the thing that connected me to my grandmother and my father and 45 years of the same kitchen, had quietly started to slip away from me? I did not like that question, but I could not stop asking it. There is a particular kind of loneliness in doubting your own senses. It is different from the loneliness of grief, which at least has a beginning you can point to. This was a drift with no origin, a slow separation from the parts of yourself you had trusted most. I had spent 45 years with that kitchen, those pots, those smells. And now I was lying in the dark, wondering if all of it had started to leave me without my noticing. The fourth morning, I drove to a hardware store before the restaurant opened and bought 2 small cameras, the kind used for security systems. I mounted one above the prep station where the gumbo started and one near the walk-in refrigerator where the ingredients were kept. I ran the cables myself. I was done before anyone arrived for the breakfast shift. I told myself one thing as I locked up and walked home in the dark. If the cameras showed me my own hands making mistakes I was no longer aware of, I would accept it. I would sit Patrick down and hand him the keys and go home and grieve in private. But if the cameras showed me something else, then everything I had suspected was true, and someone in my kitchen had been lying to me for a very long time. The footage from the first night showed nothing unusual. The second night was the same. I began to wonder if I had been wrong, if the problem really was in me after all. On the third morning, I arrived at the restaurant before 4 o'clock and settled in the office with a cup of coffee and the feed from the 2 cameras on my laptop screen. The kitchen was empty. Then the back door opened, and Carlos walked in. He moved the way he always moved, unhurried and familiar, like a man in his own home. He washed his hands. He checked the prep list on the wall, and then he walked to the walk-in refrigerator, pulled out the sealed container of fresh Gulf shrimp I had prepped the night before, and set it aside. He went to the supply closet at the back of the kitchen and returned with a bag of frozen shrimp, the kind that comes 10 pounds to a bag from a food distributor in Baton Rouge. He swapped the containers. He put my fresh shrimp in a separate bag, labeled it with the next morning's date, and slid it back in the refrigerator. The whole thing took less than 3 minutes. He did the same thing with the seasoning blend. My grandmother's spice mix, measured and jarred the way I had done it every Monday morning for 30 years, was replaced with a commercial blend from a catering supply company. Then he started the prep work for the day, moving through the kitchen with the confidence of a man who believed he was alone. I sat in the office and watched the whole thing on a small laptop screen. I did not move. I did not say anything. I just watched. When I had seen enough, I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet for a while. Then I went back to my kitchen, prepped the gumbo with the ingredients I kept locked in a separate cooler that only I had the key to, and tasted it when it was finished. It was exactly right. My grandmother's gumbo. 69 years of accumulated memory in a single bowl. I was not losing my mind. I had never lost my mind. The taste I had been chasing for 3 nights had been real. I was right. And I had always been right. And they had spent months trying to make me believe otherwise. The feeling was not triumph. It was something sadder and cleaner than triumph. It was clarity. After months of being told by the people I trusted most that my judgment was slipping, that my memory was going, that maybe it was time to sit down and let someone younger handle the difficult decisions. The evidence in that bowl told me something different. My hands still knew what they were doing. My palate still knew the truth from a lie. The kitchen had not outgrown me. I had simply been sharing it with someone who wanted to take it from me. I did not confront Carlos that morning. I said good morning when he arrived. I complimented the coffee. I smiled the way I had been smiling for months, and he smiled back, and neither of us said anything about what we both now knew. That was 18 months before Thanksgiving, 6 months before Thanksgiving, on a Tuesday morning in mid-May. I came into the kitchen at 4 o'clock, as usual. I turned on the lights above the prep station, and then, before I lit the burner, I did what Diane had taught me to do every morning of our married life. I checked the gas valve. The seal was loose, not broken, not obviously tampered with, but wrong in a way that would not be obvious unless you were looking for it. I could smell the faint trace of gas that had been seeping out since some point in the night. I stood in the kitchen in the early morning dark, and I understood what I was holding in my hands. If I had not checked, if I had been a man who did not check, a man who was distracted or forgetful or, as some people in my life had been suggesting, a little too old for this work, I would have struck the match and lit the burner, and I would not have made it out of that kitchen. Diane knew. That was what I kept thinking. Standing there in the dark, with the smell of gas still in my nose. She had made me check that valve every morning of our marriage because she understood that the day you stopped paying attention to the small things was the day the small things stopped protecting you. She had been gone for 19 years, and she was still keeping me alive. I stood in the kitchen her grandfather had built and thought 3 words, not today. Diane. I replaced the gas cylinder carefully, the same way she had taught me, because a thing worth doing is worth doing right, even when your hands want to shake. Then I went to the hardware store and waited in the parking lot until they unlocked the doors. And I bought 4 more cameras. That evening, I sat in the chair across from Diane's empty seat at the kitchen table at home, and I talked to her the way I had been doing for 19 years. They tried to take me out in your kitchen, I said. The kitchen you went back into the flood for. I was quiet for a moment. But you were there. You're always there. I opened the new notebook I had bought that morning and wrote across the first page in block letters Day 1. Below that objective, save Brennan's, save Patrick, make Diane proud. Then I closed the notebook, put it in the locked drawer where I kept her recipe book, and went to bed for the first time in months, feeling like I knew exactly what I was doing. I had known Martha Tran for 15 years, and I had never called her office on a Sunday morning before. She answered on the second ring. Martha was my lawyer, the woman who had handled my business contracts since the year after Katrina, and I told her I needed a private investigator. She was quiet for a long moment and then said, in the matter-of-fact way of someone who has spent a long time dealing in difficult truths, Walter, this could get ugly. I told her I already knew that. The investigator's name was Paul Devereaux, a former police detective from Baton Rouge, who had the particular patience of a man who understood that the most important evidence was rarely the most dramatic. We met in a coffee shop on Magazine Street 3 days after I found the tampered gas valve, and I told him everything. The photographs of the jewelry receipts, the camera footage of Carlos, the incompetency paperwork I had found on Sloane's desk when she had left the restaurant office unlocked one afternoon in February. He listened without interrupting and wrote 3 pages of notes in a small spiral notebook. And when I finished, he said, "How much time do you have?" I told him I wanted it done before Thanksgiving. That gave us 10 months. I paid Paul and Martha from the savings account I had been building for Patrick's eventual buyout of the restaurant. I had been adding to it for 11 years, a portion of the annual profits set aside for the day my son would finally be ready to take over. I emptied 2/3 of it in the first 30 days. I did not enjoy doing that. But it seemed appropriate that the money meant for Patrick's future should be what saved it. It was a strange thing, spending money on justice. Most of my life I had associated spending with building, with the next piece of equipment or the staff expansion or the renovation that would serve customers better. Spending a decade of accumulated savings to prove that someone had been stealing from you felt less like building and more like surgery, the kind that leaves a scar you carry for the rest of your life. But you do it because the alternative is worse. What followed was 10 months of living 2 separate lives. During the day, I was the Walter everyone expected. Slow, a little stiff, arriving at the restaurant before dawn the way I always had. I complimented the cooking. I talked about the weather with the lunch regulars. I let Sloane catch me misremembering the name of a new server, which was something I had done intentionally 3 times that month. She noted it. I could tell. The way she noted everything she could use. I became, for 10 months, one of the better actors in New Orleans. That is not a compliment I enjoy giving myself, but it is the truth. At night, I reviewed documents on a laptop I kept locked in the safe with Diane's recipe book. Paul would send me materials through an encrypted file system his nephew had set up, and I would read them after midnight. Alone in the kitchen, with the lights low and a cup of coffee going cold beside me. Some nights I was there until 3 o'clock in the morning, reading through bank statements and emails and photographs, building a picture of my daughter-in-law that got more disturbing the clearer it became. The falsified health inspections turned up in the Houston and Atlanta locations first. Paul found a paper trail showing Sloane had paid a contact at the inspection service to certify both kitchens without conducting full reviews. The contamination risk was real. So I drove to Houston and then to Atlanta on separate weekends, arriving in each city in the middle of the night. I let myself into the franchise kitchens with a key I had never returned after the original build-outs, worked through the pre-dawn hours, replacing the substandard ingredients, and was back in New Orleans before anyone started the breakfast shift. I am not a particularly physical man anymore. My knees have been bad since my late 50s, and a 12-hour drive followed by a night's work in a franchise kitchen is not what any doctor would recommend for a 69-year-old. But some things you do not calculate. You just do them because they need doing, and you happen to be the one who is there. I did it 4 times over 3 months. Each time I drove home alone in the dark, with my knees aching and my back sore and feeling, despite everything, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. No one in those franchise kitchens ever knew the old man who had worked through the night fixing what his daughter-in-law had broken. That was fine with me. Diane had not gone back for the recipe book so that someone would thank her either. The other thing I did in those months was write to Patrick. I bought a pad of paper and wrote him a letter every week, the way I had written to Diane before we were married, when she was living with her mother in Baton Rouge. I wrote about the restaurant, about regulars who asked after him, about things I had been thinking about his mother. I wrote about what I wished for him. I wrote 156 letters. I folded each one, sealed it in an envelope with his name on the front, and put it in the drawer of the kitchen table at home, next to his mother's empty chair. I did not send them. I knew Sloane screened his mail, and I knew that a handwritten letter from his father would make her suspicious in ways I could not afford yet. But I was not ready to stop writing to my son. Then, in October, Paul called me on a Sunday evening and said 4 words that changed the direction of everything. We found Derek Ashford. Paul sent me the file on Derek Ashford on a Thursday evening in late September. I sat in the office with the lights low and read through it twice before I could absorb what I was looking at. Derek Ashford, 34 years old, Vice President of Business Development at Magnolia Food Group, a Nashville-based restaurant corporation that had been quietly acquiring regional chains across the South for the past 7 years. Divorced. Drove a black BMW registered to the same address as an account my accountant had already flagged. I looked at the photographs Paul had attached, and then looked away. Sloane and Derek Ashford had met 14 times at the Ritz-Carlton in Atlanta over a period of 6 months. The first meeting had taken place 3 weeks after my daughter-in-law told Patrick she wanted to start going to the gym more regularly. The photographs showed them arriving together, leaving together, sharing meals in the hotel restaurant on 2 occasions, and entering the same room on every other. The timestamps were precise. I set the photographs aside and looked at the second folder in the file. The contract. Sloan had been negotiating the sale of Brennan's to Magnolia Food Group for the better part of a year. The proposed purchase price was $4,200,000, structured as a full acquisition of the trademark, the recipes, and the original location on Magazine Street. Magnolia's plan, outlined in the term sheet Paul had obtained through a contact at their Atlanta office, was to convert Brennan's into a fast casual concept they were calling Coastal Southern Kitchen. The name Brennan's would be retired within 18 months of closing. Sloan's personal arrangement included a separate consulting agreement, signed under her maiden name, for $1,800,000 payable upon completion of the sale. Patrick was not a party to any of it. I read that clause 3 times. $1,800,000. The restaurant my grandfather had built in 1949. The restaurant my father had kept alive through every economic disaster the city threw at it. The restaurant I had rebuilt from the mud after Katrina was going to become something called Coastal Southern Kitchen, and my son's wife was going to walk away with nearly $2 million for making it happen. I closed the folder and went to get another cup of coffee. I needed a minute. I had known for months that Sloan was capable of dishonesty. The cameras, the jewelry, the altered recipes had all told me that much. But there is still a distance between knowing someone is capable of a thing and holding the paperwork that proves they have already done it. Martha called me the following morning with the news about the competency petition. She had found it filed in Orleans Parish Civil District Court, a preliminary incompetency inquiry initiated under my name by an attorney I had never heard of. Attached to the filing was a supporting declaration listing 11 incidents of alleged cognitive decline over the preceding 14 months. Forgotten names, missed appointments, disoriented behavior in unfamiliar settings. A report from the Dr. Sloan had recommended I see. A man I had visited twice before I realized the appointments were producing written records that were finding their way to somewhere I had not authorized them to go. The email Paul retrieved from Sloan's personal account was dated 8 weeks before Thanksgiving. It was addressed to the attorney handling the petition. 3 sentences. Just 2 or 3 more incidents, and the court will declare him unfit to manage his own affairs. Once that happens, Patrick becomes sole trustee, and then we have everything we need. This is almost done. I sat with that email for a long time. She was not trying to steal from me. She was trying to erase me. There is a difference. A thief wants your money and will leave once they have it. What Sloan wanted was to reach back through everything I had built and replace it with something that looked similar from the outside, but had none of the same substance. The way you can empty a jar and fill it with water and put it back on the shelf, and it will look exactly the same until someone opens it. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, I sat down across from Carlos in the back office after closing. I had a folder in front of me that I opened casually, the way you open a folder when it contains nothing urgent. Inside were copies of invoices from our linen supplier, a renewal notice from our pest control company, and a handwritten note from me to Patrick about a plumbing issue in the men's room. I pushed it toward Carlos and said I needed him to make sure Patrick saw it before the holiday. I could see him reading the label on the folder before he slid it back across the desk. I knew the folder would be in Sloan's hands before midnight. I knew she would find nothing useful in it, and I knew she would conclude, from the ordinariness of what I had shown Carlos, that I had no idea what was coming. That I was still the confused old man who forgot server names and needed handwritten notes to communicate with his own son. I counted on her believing that. The Thanksgiving invitation went out the following day. Sloan confirmed within 2 hours, which told me everything I needed to know about her plans for that evening. I thought I had everything, But there was one more question I could not let go of. I called Paul on a Sunday night, 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. "One more thing," I said. "I need you to find a recording. A 911 call from the night of Hurricane Katrina, August 29th, 2005. The caller would have been trying to reach help for someone at 4871 Magazine Street." Paul was quiet for a moment. "What are you expecting to find?" I looked at Diane's apron hanging on the wall across from where I was sitting. "The truth about how my wife died," I said. The 911 recording arrived in Paul's encrypted file system on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. He had obtained it through a public records request to the New Orleans Office of Emergency Preparedness, which kept archived transcripts of all calls made during the storm response. There were thousands of them. This one had taken Paul less than a week to locate. The file sat unopened on my laptop for 4 days. I am not sure why I waited. I think part of me understood that once I heard it, certain things would become impossible to unknow, and some part of me was still arguing for the version of events I had lived with for 19 years. The version where Diane had gone back alone, where the storm had moved faster than anyone expected, where the rescue teams had simply not reached her in time. The version where nobody was responsible except the weather. I opened the file at 2 o'clock in the morning, the night before Thanksgiving. The recording was 43 seconds long. The sound quality was poor, compressed by whatever equipment the emergency center had been using that night. But the voice was clear enough. I recognized it immediately. I had been listening to that voice at my dinner table for 8 years. She gave the address as 4817 Magazine Street. The correct address was 4871, 2 numbers transposed. That was all. In the chaos of a hurricane, with water rising through the streets and the city coming apart outside every window, 2 numbers in the wrong order. The operator read the address back to her. She said yes. She confirmed it. Then the call ended. I played it again, then again. 7 times in total. Sitting alone in the kitchen of my house at 2 o'clock in the morning, while the city slept around me and Diane's apron hung on the wall across the room. Each time I listened, I watched my own hand on the table, the way it tightened and loosened around the rim of my coffee cup. I was not aware of doing it. The rescue team that night had gone to 4817 Magazine Street first. The address existed. It was a closed pharmacy 3 blocks from the restaurant. They had spent 40 minutes attempting to locate the person in distress before the operator called back with a corrected location. By then, the water at 4871 was past the window ledges. For 19 years, I had believed my wife drowned because the storm moved faster than anyone could have predicted. I had told myself that story enough times that I no longer examined it. It was simply what had happened. A tragedy without a villain, which was the worst kind, because it left you with no one to be angry at except the sky. I had stood at Diane's grave and felt guilt but not rage. I had blamed myself for not going back with her. I had blamed the levees. I had blamed the storm itself, as though weather could be held accountable. Never once in 19 years had I considered that there might have been a person on the other end of a telephone who could have made a different choice. I sat in the kitchen for a long time after the 7th play. Then I took the laptop and placed it carefully in the wooden box along with the other files, the photographs, and the documents. I picked up Diane's recipe book from the counter, the one she had died trying to save. I had been meaning for months to have the stuck pages separated by a conservator. I had never found the time. That night I found the time. I sat at the kitchen table and worked through the pages slowly and carefully, with a letter opener and a patience I had not known I still possessed. Most of them yielded without damage. Near the back of the book, in a section Diane had used for notes rather than recipes, I found a page that had been folded before the water got to it. 2 pages, actually, stuck together along the edge. I separated them the way you open something that belongs to someone else, which is slowly and with the understanding that whatever is inside was meant to be private. It was a letter, written in Diane's handwriting, in the blue ink she always used, dated the morning before the storm made landfall. I will not tell you what was in the letter. Not yet. Some things need to be heard in the right room, with the right people present, at the right moment. What I can say is that Diane had written it in the same steady handwriting she had used for 40 years of recipes and Sunday morning grocery lists. Unhurried and clear, as though she had all the time in the world. I read it once. Then I placed it back between the pages of the book, closed the cover, and held the book against my chest for a while in the quiet of my kitchen at 4 o'clock in the morning. Then I drove to the restaurant. I set the wooden box on the shelf beside the prep station, underneath Diane's apron. I stood in the middle of the empty dining room for a long time, looking at the tables and the chairs and the photographs that had come back to the walls over the years. The ones that mattered. The ones that no one had managed to take from me permanently. I looked at all of it the way you look at something before a long journey, noting the details you want to carry with you. Tomorrow, Diane, I said to the empty room. Tomorrow I finish this. I turned off the lights. I locked the door. I walked home through the New Orleans night with the smell of the river in the air and the sound of something distant playing from the direction of Frenchman Street. And I was ready. When I said, "Let me tell you how we got here," I had been talking for a long time. The candles had burned lower. No one at the table was eating any longer. The room had the quality of a held breath, the kind of collective stillness that settles in when people understand they are present at something that cannot be taken back once it begins. I set my hands flat on the table and stood fully upright. Now, I said, let me show you what I found. The first thing I removed from the wooden box was a laminated comparison sheet. 2 columns, side by side, printed on plain paper with the restaurant's letterhead at the top. The left column was titled, Original Brennan's Gumbo Recipe as written by Eloise Brennan, 1949. The right column, Current Franchise Preparation as documented, October of this year. I held it up briefly so everyone at the table could see it. Then I laid it flat and read from it aloud. Left column, fresh Gulf shrimp, sourced daily from local fisheries, homemade roux, 45 minutes minimum, andouille sausage from Camo's on Magazine Street. Cook time, 6 hours. I paused. Right column, imported frozen shrimp, bulk package, pre-mixed commercial seasoning blend, Cisco food service, industrial roux base, reconstituted, cook time, 45 minutes. The table was quiet. But that is what the Brennan's name has been attached to in Houston and Atlanta for the past 14 months. My grandmother spent 30 years perfecting that recipe. She died believing it would outlast her by a century. I did not say the next thing immediately. I had learned that the most important information does not always require emphasis. It just needs time to settle into the room. There is something about reading a list of ingredients out loud that nobody expects to land heavily. But the people at that table understood what they were hearing. They had eaten the real version for decades. Some of them had watched Diane make this dish herself, standing at the burner before the morning service opened, stirring without being reminded to, unhurried and careful, because she believed you could always taste the difference when someone rushed the work. Sloane straightened in her chair. It's called efficiency. Walter, the franchise margins required ingredient adjustments. Patrick approved the changes. I looked at Patrick. He shook his head. Barely. But I saw it. He did not, I said. And you knew that when you filed the paperwork. I set the next folder on the table. Health inspection certifications for the Houston and Atlanta locations, both certified as passing full review in the spring of this year. I opened the folder and turned it toward the table. These are the actual invoices showing what was purchased for those kitchens during the same period. Any food safety professional in this room will immediately recognize that the ingredients on these invoices are not consistent with a passing certification. One of the men across from me, a retired restaurant inspector named Hector, who had known my father, leaned forward and studied the pages. He did not say anything. He did not need to. I have already filed a complaint with the Louisiana Department of Health and the FDA, I said. The certifications were falsified. The contact at the inspection service who approved both locations without conducting proper reviews is cooperating with the investigation. I could see Sloane processing the word investigation with the particular stillness of a person waiting to discover which direction the danger is coming from. Patrick was still reading the invoices. Sloane reached for her wine glass. Then she stopped. The next item, I said, pulling out a third folder, is a summary of financial transactions from the Brennan's franchise accounts over the past 22 months. I set the printout on the table between the candles and turned it toward Patrick. $380,000 moved from the franchise operating accounts into a private account in installments, each one between $10,000 and $20,000. Each one categorized on the books as consulting fees. The recipient of all those fees is a man named Derek Ashford. The authorizing signature on each transfer belongs to my son. Patrick set down the inspection folder and reached for the printout. He read in silence. I watched his expression move through disbelief and then something else I could not quite name. Something that looked like a man standing at the edge of a familiar place, watching it change into something he no longer recognized. He ran his finger down the column of signatures. "That is not my signature," he said quietly. "No." I agreed. "It is not." I removed the final document from this folder. A handwriting analysis report prepared by an independent forensic examiner. 3 pages of technical comparison, followed by 1 sentence of conclusion. The signatures on the above-referenced transfer authorizations are not consistent with known samples of Patrick Brennan's handwriting and are assessed with high confidence to be forgeries. The word landed differently than I expected. Not like a verdict. Like a door closing on something that could not be reopened from the other side. Sloane was looking at the tablecloth with the expression of someone counting how many seconds they had left before they were required to speak. Patrick set the handwriting analysis down with careful, deliberate hands. He looked at his wife. She did not look back. I had watched my son make excuses for this woman for 8 years. I had watched him go quiet in room after room where he should have spoken. I had watched him become a man who questioned sound decisions because his wife told him to, who communicated with his father through handwritten notes and unreturned phone calls, who had lost something in the years of his marriage that I could not name precisely, but that I recognized as the particular gravity of a person who belongs fully to themselves. Something in his face was shifting now, in a way I had not seen before. Some long-held accommodation coming apart at its edges, and I understood that whatever happened in this room tonight, nothing between him and Sloane would ever return to what it had been. Sloane, he said. Her name came out in 2 syllables, flat and strange, like a word he was hearing in a new language. She reached for the wine. This time she followed through. I have more, I said simply. But the money was not the worst of it. I reached back into the wooden box. Not by a long way. From the wooden box, I removed a manila folder and set it in the center of the table. This is a legal filing from Orleans Parish Civil District Court, I said. A preliminary incompetency inquiry, filed under my name, initiated by an attorney I had never met. Attached to the filing is a supporting declaration listing 11 specific incidents of alleged cognitive decline. I opened the folder and turned it toward the table. Forgotten employee names, missed appointments, disoriented behavior in unfamiliar settings, a notation that I appeared confused about a recent business decision, another that I was seen wandering near the restaurant late at night. I paused. Every item on this list was either staged, misrepresented, or arranged in advance. The forgotten employees are people Sloane had recently hired specifically because she knew I would not recognize them. The reported disorientation occurred at a franchise location that had been substantially redesigned without my knowledge. The late-night wandering was me installing security cameras after I found the tampered gas valve, and the doctor whose written report is included in this filing was recommended to me by Sloane herself. The appointments were designed to produce documentation, not to provide care. I visited twice before I understood what those records were being used to build. There was a sound from the other end of the table. Miss Loretta had set down her coffee cup. She had known my family for 4 decades, and she was looking at Sloane with the particular stillness of someone who has lived long enough to recognize something genuinely dangerous when it sits directly across from them. Patrick's chair scraped back slightly. He was not getting up. He was trying to put distance between himself and what he was hearing. She filed papers with a court, he said. Yes, I could see him working through what that meant, the way you work through a calculation that keeps arriving at an answer you do not want to accept. For most of his marriage, there had always been another explanation. He had accepted each one not because he was foolish, but because he was someone who needed to believe the charitable version. And Sloane had understood from early on that he would keep believing it as long as she kept providing one. The filing has been withdrawn, I said. The attorney has agreed to cooperate with the investigation. Sloane finally spoke. I was protecting our future, she said. Your father has been making decisions that put this family at financial risk for years. Someone needed to take responsibility for making sure the assets stayed in the family when he was no longer capable of. Whose future? Patrick said. He did not raise his voice. The words came out flat and deliberate, like something placed carefully on a table rather than thrown across one. Your name is on the consulting agreement. Your account received the $380,000. Who exactly were you protecting? Sloane. There was a long moment where the only sound was one of the candles burning down in its holder. Sloane looked around the table. I watched her do it. checking each face for an ally, a neutral party, anyone who might offer a moment of cover. She found no one. She set her hands in her lap and said nothing. I reached into the box for the next folder. These are photographs, I said. 14 of them. I spread them across the table in 2 rows of 7, each one printed in color, each one marked with a date and a location in the lower corner. The first photograph showed Sloane and a man I had not yet named walking through the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton in Atlanta on a January evening. She was carrying a weekend bag. His hand was at the small of her back. Patrick looked at the photographs without touching them for a long moment. Then he picked up the first one. He did not skip any. He did not look up. He did not speak. I watched his hands move from one photograph to the next, with the controlled deliberateness of a man keeping himself from doing something else entirely. When he reached the last one, he set it down on top of the others and placed both palms flat against the table. Sloane had gone very still. She was watching her husband the way you watch a board after an unexpected move, calculating possible responses and finding that none of them led anywhere useful. "Who is he?" Patrick said. It was not a question. "Hi." "Derek Ashford," I said. "Vice President at Magnolia Food Group. 34 years old." I waited while Patrick looked at his wife, and she looked somewhere else entirely. "He is also the sole recipient of all the consulting fees transferred from your company accounts." Sloane shifted in her chair. She straightened with the deliberate composure of a person who has decided their only remaining option is to attack. "You hired someone to follow me," she said. "You had a private investigator watching my movements for months. That is a violation of my privacy. That is something any reasonable attorney would take very seriously. My son's signature was being forged on financial transfers," I said. "I had every reason. This is an old man who cannot accept that his time has passed, who has spent years poisoning his son against the people trying to help him, there are moments when desperation makes a person say something that everyone in the room immediately recognizes for exactly what it is. I watched that recognition move through the table like a current. The attack had come because she had run out of arguments, and everyone present knew it. "He is not only your boyfriend," I said. My voice came out quieter than I intended, and somehow the quietness stopped her more completely than volume would have. "He is the man you have been negotiating with for the past 11 months. About this restaurant." Sloane's eyes moved to the folder still in my hands. "She was not just sleeping with him, Patrick," I said. "She was making a deal with him." I set the folder on the table and opened the cover. Patrick reached for it before I had finished. Patrick read the term sheet without looking up. He turned to the first page, then the second, then the last. His face did not show the kind of distress that announces itself loudly. It showed something quieter and more serious. The particular gravity of a man encountering something he will not be able to forget. He set it down. "The proposed purchase price is $4,200,000, I said. "Structured as a full acquisition of the trademark, the original location, the brand identity, and all recipe assets. Magnolia's development plan, outlined on the 3rd page, describes converting Brennan's into a fast casual concept they are calling Coastal Southern Kitchen. The Brennan's name would be retired within 18 months of closing." Patrick looked up from the table for the first time in several minutes. "You are going to sell this restaurant," he said to his wife. "It is an asset," Sloane said. It is an underperforming asset in a high-cost market with aging infrastructure and a customer base that is literally aging out. The rational business decision. You were going to sell my grandmother's restaurant, Patrick said again. Patrick, this is not a shrine. This is a business. And your father has been running it like a memorial instead of an enterprise for 20 years. The restaurant my mother died trying to save, he said. You were going to sell that restaurant to a fast food company and rename it. Sloane set her glass down with a small, deliberate sound. It is just a building. Patrick. The room went a degree quieter than it had been before. I had been waiting to speak since she said those words. And now I spoke. It is not a building, I said. It is the kitchen where your grandmother learned to cook from a woman who came through the Depression and kept her family fed through things that should not have been survivable. It is the room where your father served his first meal at the age of 12, and where I served mine at the same age. It is where Diane spent every Sunday morning making bread pudding for no particular reason, except that she loved this place and believed it deserved care. It is where she went back during the hurricane, in the dark, in rising water, because she believed it was worth protecting. I paused. And you called it just a building. Sloane said nothing. There is also the matter of the separate consulting agreement, I said, pulling the attached page from the folder and setting it on the table. Signed in Sloane's maiden name, payable on close, $1,800,000. Patrick was not a party to the negotiation and was not informed of the agreement's existence. Patrick looked at the page. Then he looked at his wife. Something in his face was doing an arithmetic that the rest of him did not want to complete. Patrick looked more carefully at the line item where Sloane's name had been changed back to her maiden name the way you change a name when you do not want it connected to something. The consulting fee amount sat in a column of its own, separate from all other disbursements, as though even the document had been designed to avoid drawing the eye. You had a separate payment, he said slowly. You were going to receive $1,800,000 from the sale of my family's restaurant. Put it under a different name, and not tell me. Sloane opened her mouth. Patrick looked away before she could speak. I stood up from my chair and turned toward the kitchen door. Carlos, I said, would you come out here? Please. There was a moment of quiet from the kitchen. The kind of quiet that happens in a room when someone has stopped moving. Then the door swung open, and Carlos stepped through it, still wearing his apron, the one he had worn in one version or another for 18 years. Diane had embroidered his name along the hem of the first one, small, careful letters in navy thread, the Christmas after he started working here. He stood in the middle of the dining room and did not look at anyone. I reached into the wooden box and removed the last folder of documents Paul had prepared. I set it open on the table. These are emails, I said. Sent from Carlos's personal account to Sloane's personal account over a period of 14 months. They include the combination to the safe where I keep Diane's recipe book, my weekly schedule, notes about my health that I had shared with Carlos in private conversations because I trusted him and because he had worked here longer than some of these chairs. Each email was sent within 24 hours of the conversation it referenced. The dining room was very still. I looked at Carlos. He was looking at the floor. Diane loved you, I said. She embroidered your name herself on that apron you are wearing right now. The first Christmas you worked here. She told me you were the kind of person who would be family someday. Carlos made a sound that was not quite a word. She said that. I continued. And I believed her. And I want you to know that I understand why she believed it. Because for a long time I believed it too. Carlos finally looked up. His eyes were wet, and his jaw was working at something he could not find the shape of. I turned back to the table. I did not say anything more to Carlos. I did not tell him to leave or ask him to explain. I simply turned away. The way you turn from something you loved that has become something you can no longer look at without feeling the full weight of what it was. He went back through the kitchen door. It swung closed behind him. The dining room waited. "Now," I said, sitting back down and reaching into the wooden box. There is the recording. I set the small recording device on the table between the breadbasket and the last of the candles. It was the kind of device that fits in a shirt pocket. The kind Paul's contact had been carrying at the coffee shop on Magazine Street, the afternoon Sloane and Derek Ashford met there in October to discuss what was taking so long. Paul had described the recording to me before he sent it. He had said, "This one is going to be difficult to hear." I told him I already knew that. I pressed play. The recording was 22 minutes long in total, but the relevant section began about 7 minutes in. When the coffee shop had quieted and the voices had become clearer, Sloane's voice, and the voice of a man I recognized as Derek Ashford's from the other recordings Paul had obtained. I let the first part play without interruption. Then Sloane said, "Patrick is the easiest man I have ever managed. All you have to do is tell him he is smart, and he will believe anything you follow it with. I learned that in the first month." I stopped the recording. The table was absolutely still. I looked at the rest of the room. Miss Loretta was watching Patrick, the way a person watches someone they have known since childhood navigate something they cannot help with. Hector had set both hands flat on the table. The woman who ran the bakery 2 blocks away had her eyes closed. No one at that table was looking at Sloane. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I pressed play again. Derek Ashford said something I could not quite make out. Sloane laughed. That particular laugh she used when she felt entirely comfortable and entirely sure of herself. Then she said, "His mother dying was genuinely the best thing that could have happened to our timeline. It broke the old man, and it made Patrick desperate for someone to tell him what to do. He has been looking for a replacement for her ever since she died. And I was available." I stopped the recording. Patrick had not moved. He had not made a sound. He was sitting in his chair the way a person sits when something structural has given way inside them, and they are waiting to discover what else is going to follow it down. Sloane started to speak. "Patrick, you meant it," he said. His voice had the quality of something scraped completely clean. "You meant every word of it." So I was venting. People say things in private that they would never say directly to the person. It does not reflect how I actually— "You meant it," he said again. The second time was quieter than the first, which made it heavier. Sloane looked at me. It was the first time all evening she had looked at me as though I were someone she genuinely needed to reach. There was something in her eyes I had not seen there before. It looked almost like a calculation that had finally arrived at a number it had not been prepared for. "You have been building a case against me for years," she said. "Compiling evidence, turning my own husband against me in his father's dining room on a holiday. What kind of man does that? The kind whose daughter-in-law has been lying to him for 8 years. I said. I reached into the box one last time and removed a single sheet of paper in a protective sleeve. "This is an email," I said. Sent by Sloane to a college friend approximately 10 days before her wedding to Patrick. I obtained it through Paul's investigation, which included a review of communications stored in a secondary account Sloane did not realize was still linked to a device that backed up to a shared server. I slid it across the table to Patrick. He read it. I watched his eyes move across the page and reach the end, and then go back to the beginning and read it again. The restaurant alone is worth $3 million. He read aloud, his voice entirely flat. The old man cannot live forever. This is the easiest investment I will ever make. He set the paper down and placed both hands on top of it. The way you put your hands on something to keep it from going anywhere, as though it might escape if he let go. You never loved me, he said to his wife. Not on our wedding day? Not the day you agreed to marry me? Not for a single morning of our entire marriage. Sloane looked at him for a long moment. And then she said, with the kind of deliberate steadiness that is itself a form of cruelty, people are more complicated than you give them credit for. Patrick. People change, I said. Predators do not. Patrick stood up slowly. He was not the same man who had sat down at the beginning of this dinner. Something essential had resolved itself in him that could not be undone, and it had changed the shape of how he held his own body, the way he occupied the space around him. He looked at his wife from his full height. She did not look away this time. How long? He said to her. How long has everything been a lie? Sloane said nothing. I looked at my son standing across the table from the woman he had married. I thought of the boy he had been, the one who used to sit at my kitchen table on Sunday mornings telling me about things he had read, before all of that was slowly buried. And I thought, there he is. There is the man Diane and I raised. I felt proud, not of what was being destroyed, of the man who was standing up in the middle of it. Sit down, son, I said quietly. There is one more thing, the last thing. My voice did something I had not permitted it to do all evening. It wavered, just slightly, just once. This one is about your mother. There is something I need to tell you about the night Hurricane Katrina made landfall, I said. About what happened before the storm reached the city, and about a young woman named Sloane who had been seeing my son for 3 months. Patrick looked at me. The name had landed differently than anything else I had said tonight. 3 months, he said. 3 months, I confirmed. Which means she was with you when the storm came. I did not know that then. Diane did not know it. We knew about the girl you had been seeing, but we did not know her name, and we had not met her. You were going to bring her to dinner the following month. The following month. Diane had been dead for 4 weeks. I have thought about this more times than I can count. The timing. The way everything that followed was shaped by those 3 months in which a woman my son was dating was already measuring our family's value and finding it acceptable. The night the storm came ashore, I said. Your mother called you. She was at the restaurant. The water was rising faster than the news reports had said it would, and she was on the 2nd floor with the recipe book, and she needed someone to reach the emergency services before the phones went down. She called you. Patrick was very still. You were with Sloane, I said. And Sloane was the one who made the call. I reached into the wooden box and removed the recording device I had placed there alongside everything else. This one was different from the device I had used for the Ashford recording. This was older, a playback unit for archival audio, the kind Paul had needed because the original file format was from 19 years ago. This is the 911 recording from August 29th, 2005, I said. The call was placed at 10:47 in the evening, approximately 35 minutes after your mother first attempted to reach help. The New Orleans Office of Emergency Preparedness maintains archives of all storm response calls. Paul obtained this through a public records request. I set the device on the table between the candles. Sloane had not moved. She had been very still for the past several minutes. But this was a different kind of stillness. This was the stillness of a person who has heard the sound of something they buried a long time ago beginning to come up through the ground. Before I play this, I said, I want to tell you what it contains, so that you are prepared. The room was listening in a way I had not experienced before in this or any other room in 69 years of life. The complete, focused attention of people who understand that something is being said that cannot be taken back, and that will change the shape of whatever comes after it. The caller gives your mother's address as 4817 Magazine Street, I said. The correct address was 4871, 2 numbers transposed. I let that sit for a moment. The rescue team dispatched from the emergency center went to 4817 Magazine Street first. That address exists. It is a pharmacy, 3 blocks from this restaurant. They spent 40 minutes searching the wrong location before the dispatch center was able to reach them with a corrected address. I paused again. The water at 4871 was rising the entire time they were looking. The candle nearest to me had burned down to almost nothing. I could see the wax pooling at the base of the holder, outside, through the windows that faced the street. The rain that had been falling all evening had grown heavier in the last hour, and I was aware of it in a way I had not been earlier. There were people at that table who had been in New Orleans the night of the storm. I could see it in their faces, the way old memory surfaces when something pulls it up. Miss Loretta had lost her house that night. Hector had spent 3 days on a roof before the boats came. The storm was not history to the people in this room. It was something that lived in their bodies. I have spent 19 years believing that your mother died because the storm moved faster than the emergency teams could respond. I said, that was the story I told myself at her graveside. That was the story I told you when you were old enough to ask. That was the story I accepted because I had no reason to question it, and because questioning it would have meant looking at something I was not prepared to see. Patrick had his eyes fixed on the recording device the way you look at something you are not sure you want to keep looking at, but cannot make yourself stop. When Paul retrieved this recording, I said, he called me before he sent it. He said, Walter, you need to be sitting down. I told him I was already standing and that I intended to stay that way. I looked at Sloane one last time before I played it. She was looking at the table, not at me, not at Patrick, at the tablecloth, at the half-empty wine glass she had not reached for in the last 20 minutes, at the space directly in front of her where there was nothing to look at except the thing she had been carrying for 19 years. She knew what was on that recording. She had always known. This is the voice, I said, of the person who made the call. I pressed play. The recording lasted 43 seconds. The first 15 or so were background noise, the sound of wind and rain and something distant that might have been a siren or the storm itself finding its voice. And then the operator's voice, trained to calm regardless of what was happening outside the windows. And then through the static. A voice I recognized. Everyone in that room recognized it. The address came at roughly the 20-second mark. 4817 Magazine Street. Not 4871. The operator read it back. The voice confirmed it. Then the call ended. I stopped the recording. The rescue team went to 4817 Magazine Street first. I said. The address exists. It is a pharmacy, 3 blocks from here. They spent 40 minutes looking for the person before the dispatch center contacted them with a corrected location. I looked at Patrick. Now, the water at 4871 was above the windows of the second floor by the time they arrived. I said, "Your mother was found on the second floor. She was still holding the recipe book." I stopped talking and let the room sit with that. With what 40 minutes meant in a city being swallowed by water in the dark. With what 40 minutes meant for a woman on the second floor of a building, holding a book she believed was worth protecting. The people at that table had all lived through that night. They did not need me to explain what 40 minutes looked like. The room was silent in a way that I had never heard a room be silent before. Not the silence of people being polite. The silence of people who have had something taken from them that they had not known they were still carrying. If they had the right address, I said, they would have reached her in time. Patrick was looking at his wife. "You killed my mother," he said. The words were not loud. They came out in the same tone a man might use to state a fact he has just finished verifying. Something final and flat and beyond the reach of argument. Sloane had gone very pale. Her hands were in her lap, and she was not looking at anything in the room. "It was a mistake," she said. "I was panicking. The storm was everywhere and the phones were bad and I gave the wrong numbers. It was an accident. The operator read the address back to you." I said, "You confirmed it." I was not thinking clearly. I was frightened. I was 25 years old in the middle of a hurricane, and my boyfriend's mother was trapped, and I was trying to help, and I made a mistake. "You made a mistake," I said. "And then you waited 19 years to tell anyone." Sloane said nothing. "You married my son 3 years after that night." I said, "You sat at this table every Thanksgiving for 8 years. You looked me in the eye at Diane's anniversary every year when I wore her ring. You said her name out loud in front of me. You said she was lucky to leave. You said that to me, knowing what you knew." I stopped. And tonight, in this room, in front of these people who loved her, you called her death a blessing. Something happened in the room then. A sound near the door, low and grief-stricken. One of the men across from Hector stood up and walked toward the entrance without speaking. He was not rude about it. He simply could not stay. Miss Loretta had both hands pressed over her mouth. Patrick had not moved. He was still looking at his wife with the expression of a man who has been handed a document that rearranges 19 years of memory into a shape he no longer recognizes. "You let me blame myself," he said to her, "for not going back with her, for not being the one who answered the phone. I have spent 19 years believing that if I had picked up instead of you, she might have lived. You let me carry that." He turned to face her and said it again in a voice that had found its lowest register. The voice of a man speaking from somewhere underneath where grief normally lives. "You sat across from me at her birthday every year, and you let me carry that, Sloane opened her mouth. Nothing came. "I would like you to explain," Patrick said, "how that was a mistake. The wrong address was a mistake. What came after it was not." The candles had nearly gone out. The last one on the far side of the table had been burning at a steep angle for several minutes, and now it sputtered twice and went dark, leaving the room lit only by the lights above the kitchen pass-through and the glow from the street. I picked up the recipe book from the table. "There is one last thing," I said. "Something Diane wrote the night before the hurricane. Something I found last month, in the back pages of this book." I paused. I was not ready to open it before tonight, but I am ready now. I opened the recipe book to the back section, where Diane had kept her notes on dishes she was still developing, her handwriting looser there, less precise than in the recipe pages themselves, more like the way a person writes when they are thinking out loud, rather than recording something final. Near the last page I found the folded section. 2 pages, stuck together at the edge by 19 years of dried storm water. The paper slightly warped from where the moisture had worked its way through. I had separated them myself a week ago, in the kitchen at home, at 4 o'clock in the morning, alone. I turned to that section now. The handwriting was in the blue ink Diane always used. The date at the top of the first page read August 28th, 2005. The morning before the storm made landfall, the morning before she made the decision to go back. I found this last month," I said. I had not known it was there. The pages had been stuck together since the night of the storm, and I had not opened that section of the book in 19 years because I was not sure I could. I looked up at the table. "I am reading it to you tonight because it belongs to all of us, not just to me." I began to read. "Walter," the letter began, "if something happens tonight, I need you to know a few things." The room did not move. This restaurant is not a building. I know you know that. But I need you to hear me say it in writing so that on the days when someone tries to convince you otherwise, you can come back to this page and remember. This restaurant is our love. It is your grandfather's hands and your father's stubbornness and every Sunday morning I have ever spent in that kitchen. It is not worth more than you are, but it is worth protecting. Don't ever let anyone take it from you." Patrick had both hands pressed against the table. He was not looking at anything I could see. "Give this book to Patrick when he is ready." I continued reading. "You will know when. He will know too. I think he has more of his grandfather in him than either of you realize. And I think someday that will become obvious to everyone. Do not lose patience with him in the meantime." I had to stop for a moment. I had not anticipated that sentence. It caught me somewhere I was not prepared to be caught. I had known the letter was there for a week. I had read it 3 times in my own kitchen, alone, at varying hours of the night. But reading it aloud, in this room, with Patrick sitting across from me and the recipe book open between my hands, was something entirely different. The words had a weight they had not carried on a page. I steadied myself and read on. "And Walter, I love you. I have always loved you. I loved you the first time I saw you drop an entire pot of gumbo on your own shoes and pretend nothing had happened. I loved you every morning of this marriage, I loved you in all the ways a person can love someone over 40 years of waking up next to them. I stopped reading. The room was doing something I had not fully anticipated. There was a sound coming from more than one direction, low and quiet, the sound of people trying not to be heard. Patrick had his face in his hands. Miss Loretta was not trying to hide anything. Outside, the rain against the windows had intensified in the last several minutes. I could hear it now more clearly. The kind of heavy New Orleans rain that makes everything beyond the glass look like it exists at a distance, in a separate version of the world from the one inside. I folded the letter carefully along its original crease and placed it back between the pages of the book. Don't eat dinner alone for too long. I finished. That was the last line. I closed the cover and held the book against my chest for a moment. There was a long moment when I simply held it. This book that Diane had gone back for. This book that had come out of the flood because she believed it was worth more than her safety. I thought about what it had cost and what it had given back. Then I set it on the table and looked at Sloane, not with anger. The anger had burned out somewhere in the middle of the night 3 weeks ago when I sat alone in my kitchen and listened to the 911 recording for the 7th time and understood what I was hearing. What was left on the other side of that was quieter and colder and, I think, more honest. My wife died holding this book, I said, because she believed our family was worth saving. You spent 8 years trying to prove her wrong. I paused. She wins. She always wins. Patrick lifted his face from his hands. He looked at his wife for a long moment, and then he said, in a voice that was the steadiest thing I had heard from him all evening, "Get out of my mother's restaurant. Get out and never come back." Sloane looked around the table. She found no one. She stood up from her chair. She did not move gracefully. She bumped the edge of the table, set the wine glass rocking, and walked toward the front door with the particular gait of someone who has lost the physical steadiness that confidence provides. The bell above the door rang when she opened it. It rang again when it closed behind her. The dining room went completely still, and then, very slowly, the people at that table began to breathe again. The guests left slowly, the way people leave a place after something has shifted that cannot be shifted back. Miss Loretta was the last of the regulars to go. She held my face in both hands the way she had at Diane's graveside, looking at me with the particular directness of a woman who has spent 81 years refusing to look away from things. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She squeezed my face once, firmly, and walked to the door, and the bell rang as she went. When the last person had gone, it was just Patrick and me. He was still at the table. He had not moved from his chair since Sloane walked out. His hands were in front of him, his elbows on the table, his head bowed slightly forward in the way of a man who is taking inventory of something substantial. I brought 2 cups of coffee from the kitchen and sat down across from him. The candle holders were empty now. The dining room was lit by the overhead lights above the kitchen pass-through, and outside, the rain was steady and quiet against the windows. "Dad," Patrick said, "I'm so sorry." "Don't apologize for tonight," I said. "Just sit with me." We sat in silence for a while. I had forgotten what it felt like to sit quietly with my son. Sloane had filled silence the way some people fill silence, with noise and movement and the constant low hum of someone who needed to be managing something. In her absence, the room had a kind of spaciousness that I had not felt in years. I looked at him the way you look at a room that has been rearranged after years of the same configuration. Everything still in it that was always there, but visible again. "How did you know?" Patrick said eventually. "How did you figure out what she was doing before any of us could see it?" I thought about that for a moment. "You stopped laughing," I said. "That was the first thing I noticed. Not right away, but over time. You used to laugh at things the way your mother laughed, with your whole face. A couple of years into the marriage, that stopped." Patrick said nothing. "She convinced you that life required constant vigilance," I said. "That success meant always watching for the next threat. That love meant being accountable for things that were not your fault. She built you a version of the world that was very demanding and very small, and you fit yourself into it because you trusted her. And that is not a weakness. That is what a person does with someone they love." He was looking at his hands. "Diane always said I was too trusting." I said, "After she died, I stopped trusting my own instincts about people because I was afraid of being wrong in a way I could not afford. But eventually the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. And when it did, I did what Diane always said I was good at doing when I finally paid attention. I paid attention." Patrick looked up at me then. His eyes were red, but he was not crying. "There is something I want to give you," I said. I got up from the table and went to the back office where I had brought the drawer from the kitchen table at home. Just for tonight. I carried it to the dining room and set it on the table between us. Inside were the envelopes, 156 of them, each one addressed in my handwriting, each one sealed, each one dated. The oldest was from more than a year ago. The newest was from last Tuesday. "I have been writing to you every week." I said, "I did not send them because I was not sure they would reach you, and I was not ready to have them intercepted and used against me." I paused. "But they were meant for you. They were always meant for you." Patrick reached into the drawer and picked up the top envelope. He turned it over in his hands. He read the date on the back. He set it down and reached in again and picked up another, older one. And then he sat with them for a long time without opening them, just holding them, the way you hold something you did not know you had been waiting for. "Was there anything in them worth reading?" he said finally. I told you about the restaurant," I said. "About the regulars. About the things I had been thinking about your mother. About what I wished for you." I looked at the stack of envelopes. There was not much in my life this past year that I did not put in those letters. Patrick set the envelopes back in the drawer carefully, one by one. We sat in the empty restaurant for another hour after that. The rain did not stop. The lights stayed on. At some point, I refilled the coffee and we talked. Not about Sloane or the investigation or what came next, but about smaller things. About a dish Diane used to make on cold evenings. About the summer Patrick was 9 years old and we all drove to Biloxi and he got stung by something in the water and cried for 20 minutes and then demanded to go back in. He laughed when I said that. A real laugh. Not the compressed, careful sound he had been producing for years, but the full version of it. It was the first time all evening I had heard it, and it was the first time in a very long while that it had reached his eyes. Eventually, Patrick looked toward the kitchen. "Can I stay tonight?" he said. "I don't want to go back to that house." "This restaurant has always been your home, son," I said. The weeks that followed moved the way the aftermath of difficult things tends to move. Slowly at first, and then all at once. Paul called me the Monday after Thanksgiving. He had been in contact with the FBI field office throughout the investigation, and the case had already been referred before I served Sloan with the evidence at the dinner. The combination of the forged signatures, the falsified health certifications, and the embezzlement charges gave the federal prosecutor enough to work with that the question was not whether to charge, but how quickly. Sloan was arrested 11 days after Thanksgiving. She was charged with wire fraud, identity theft, corporate embezzlement, and falsifying federally mandated health and safety documentation. She was released on bail set at $400,000, pending trial. Derek Ashford was terminated by Magnolia Food Group within 72 hours of the story becoming public. Magnolia withdrew from the acquisition. The attorney who had filed the incompetency petition against me submitted a voluntary withdrawal and requested to be removed from the state bar's active referral list. Martha told me she had also submitted a formal ethics complaint against him. She said she expected it to go somewhere. The trial moved more quickly than I expected. Martha explained that when defendants face federal charges this substantial, they usually prefer to negotiate rather than risk a jury. Sloan pled guilty to corporate embezzlement and federal documentation fraud in February. The judge sentenced her to 4 years in federal prison, with restitution to be paid from her personal accounts. The $1,800,000 from the Magnolia consulting agreement had been frozen before it could be transferred. Every cent of it was seized as evidence. Patrick filed for divorce in early December. He called me the morning he filed. He did not say much. He just said, "It's done." I told him I was proud of him. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "Don't be proud of me yet. There is a lot I still need to fix." Patrick was quiet for most of December. He called me most evenings, but the calls were short. He was processing things, and I understood that processing was not something I could help with by providing more information or more conversation. What he needed was time. I had learned something about time and grief over 19 years that I thought was useful. It moves. Not quickly. Not always in the direction you expect. But it moves. He spent the first 3 weeks of December going to Houston and Atlanta in person. He met with the franchise staff, explained what had happened, and apologized to the managers who had carried the consequences of decisions they had not known were fraudulent. He hired an independent firm to conduct full health and safety audits of both locations. He closed both franchises temporarily until the audits were complete. He did all of this without anyone telling him to. That was the part I found most meaningful. Paul called me again in the second week of December, late in the evening. "The district attorney's office has been reviewing the 911 call," he said. "They believe there may be grounds for additional charges related to the delay in emergency response. They want to know if you are interested in cooperating with that aspect of the investigation." I sat with that question for a while. "No," I said. Paul was quiet. "The embezzlement charges are sufficient," I said. And Diane would not have wanted that pursued. She would have said the same thing she always said about people who had done her wrong, that they had enough to carry already. Let the other charges stand. Let it end. Paul said he understood. Carlos came to me 2 days before Christmas. He stood outside the back door of the restaurant for 10 minutes before he knocked. I had seen him through the kitchen window, and I let him stand there. Not to be unkind, but because I thought the time it took him to knock was his own business and not mine to shorten. He handed in his keys without being asked. He said he was sorry in the way a person says sorry when they know the word is not large enough, and they are saying it anyway because there is no better option. I told him the door was always open, that whether he walked back through it was his decision to make, not mine to make for him. He nodded and left. I stood at the door for a while after he walked away. It was cold for December in New Orleans. I watched him get into his car and drive out onto Magazine Street and disappear. I thought about what Diane had said the day she embroidered his name on that first apron, that this one has a good heart. She had been right. A good heart used for the wrong purposes is still a good heart. It just needs to find its way back. In January, Patrick appeared at my door at 6 o'clock in the morning. He was wearing jeans and a flannel shirt I had not seen before, and he was holding Diane's old apron, the one from the wall, which I had brought home after the Thanksgiving dinner. "I need to learn how to make the gumbo," he said. "The real version, from scratch." I looked at him, standing there in the early morning dark of a January in New Orleans, his breath slightly visible in the cold, holding his mother's apron like a man who has decided what he wants to carry going forward. The street behind him was empty. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something in the dark. I had been waiting for this version of my son for a very long time. I opened the door wider. "Come in," I said. "We start at 4 in the morning. That is when the real cooks begin." 8 months later, on a morning in late August, the smell of real gumbo drifted out of the kitchen at Brennan's for the first time in what felt like a very long time. Patrick had been at the restaurant since 4 o'clock. I had been there since 3:30. Because I had not been sleeping well, and I had decided some time ago that the best place to be when you cannot sleep is somewhere you love. By the time he arrived, I had the roux started, and I handed him the spoon without saying anything. And he took it. He cooked the gumbo from the original recipe, the one his great-grandmother had developed across 3 decades of Sunday mornings and written down in the blue ink she used for all the important things. He made mistakes. He burned the roux on the second attempt and had to start over. He overcorrected the seasoning and had to add more stock. He stood at that stove for 6 hours without complaint, and when it was finished, he tasted it and looked at me and said, "Is that right?" It was exactly right. I took the recipe book from the shelf and set it in his hands. "Your mother said I would know when you were ready," I said. She was right. I know now. Patrick held the book the way he had held the envelopes, with the careful attention of a man who understands that some things cannot be replaced. He opened the first page. There was his great-grandmother's handwriting, dated 1949, the year the restaurant opened. He ran one finger along the words without quite touching them, the way you do when you are reading something that matters. The new sign went up on the last Thursday of August. Beside the original Brennan's lettering, a second board in the same hand, Brennan and Son, established 1949, rebuilt 2005, reborn 2025. The first customers of the reopening were people who had been eating here since before I was running the kitchen. Raymond Thibodeau drove up from Houston. Miss Loretta arrived at 11 in the morning with her daughter and took her regular seat. Hector came with his wife. People I had not seen in 3 years walked through the front door as though they had never left, which in the ways that mattered most, they had not. Raymond was the first one in. He ordered the gumbo without looking at the menu. When the bowl came out, he picked up his spoon, tasted it, and set the spoon down. Then he looked across the room at me and nodded once. That was all. I stood in the kitchen doorway and understood, for the first time all day, that we had done the right thing. That evening, after the service ended and the last customer had gone, Patrick and I sat at the corner table. Diane's chair was across from me. Patrick sat in it. He had asked me 2 weeks earlier whether he could, and I had said yes without hesitation, because the chair was not a memorial. It was a place to sit, and Diane had told me not to eat dinner alone for too long. "Dad," Patrick said, "I'm sorry for everything." "You don't need to be sorry," I said. "You just need to be here, behind us." The apron was back on the wall where it belonged. The photographs that had been taken down were back in their frames. The restaurant looked the way it had always looked when someone was taking care of it properly. I put my hand on top of the recipe book. Outside, New Orleans was doing what it always does, filling itself back up at the end of the day. Traffic on Magazine Street, someone with a radio down the block, the smell of coffee from the corner place, the thick August air settling against the glass. "He is ready, Diane," I said quietly. "Our boy is finally ready." Patrick left not long after that, and I let him go without following. Some things are better finished alone. I sat at that table for a while. Just me and the recipe book, and the city outside the windows, and the restaurant around me. Quiet the way a room is quiet after it has been full of people, and is now at rest. I thought about the things a man understands only after he has come close to losing them. I had come close, not just to losing this building or the name above the door, but to losing the version of my son I had always known was in there, and to losing my own certainty that the things worth protecting were worth the fight. There were months, in the middle of everything, when I was not sure I would get either of them back. When a man reaches that point, the only thing that keeps him going is the memory of who first showed him what fighting for something actually looks like. What saved me was not the evidence or the plan or the 10 months of silence I carried alone. It was a woman who had been gone for 19 years and who had the good sense to write down what she knew in a book she believed was worth going back for. The lesson she left me is not a complicated one. Love is not passive. It does not sit still and wait for things to work out on their own. It requires you to stand in the way of whatever would destroy it, for as long as it takes, with whatever you have. God gave her that conviction, and God preserved what she wrote for 19 years, kept it between stuck pages of a waterlogged book until the night her family was finally ready to hear it. If you have ever loved something you were afraid of losing, if you have ever built something that someone else decided they had a right to take apart, then you already know what this story is about. God does not abandon the things we love. Neither should we. If this story reached you tonight, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. I would like to know how far Diane's story has traveled. Share it with someone who may need to hear it right now. And if you have not yet followed this channel, please take a moment to do that so you will not miss the stories still to come. Every story I tell is one I believe is worth telling. Thank you for listening to this one.